Wire the first installment by Friday. Your father needs to finalize the RV deposit. I sat in a mesh office chair in a shared workspace in Chandler, Arizona, reading a demand for money I had never promised from parents I had not spoken to in 3 weeks. Outside, the desert heat baked the asphalt, rising in faint ripples against the tinted glass of the building. Inside, the industrial air conditioning hummed. I was drinking burnt coffee from a paper cup, staring at a text message that treated me like a bank. They had no idea that the money they were trying to claim was locked behind a corporate non-disclosure agreement, or that their greed was about to walk them right into a trap they built themselves. Welcome back to QT Told Stories, where quiet women finally hand over the receipts. My name is Lydia Claire, and I am 23 years old. Drop a comment, tell me your age, and hit subscribe, because if you have ever been the designated ATM for your relatives, you will want to hear exactly how this ends. My phone vibrated again against the synthetic wood grain of my desk. A second message appeared under the first. Lydia. Answer me. We know you have it. I did not reply. Instead, I reached forward and adjusted the brightness on my dual monitors, clicking the interface down 2 precise increments. The harsh white light shifted to a soft amber. When the people who are supposed to be your foundation are actively trying to capsize your life, you find small ways to regulate your physical space. You lower the glare on a screen. You align a keyboard flush with the edge of a desk. You control the elements that actually respond to your input, because the people on the other end of the phone never will. My family operated under a sudden, unshakable conviction that I was hoarding a windfall. To them, I was sitting on a bottomless reservoir of cash, obligated to fund luxury vehicles and wipe away their accumulated mistakes. The contrast between my actual Tuesday writing back-end algorithms under fluorescent lights, wearing a faded sweater, and the extravagant delusion they had constructed was jarring. But the text itself was not the source of the cold knot forming in my stomach. It was the sheer presumption behind the words, the unquestioned certainty that whatever I possessed belonged inherently to them. They did not ask if I had the funds available. They did not ask how I was doing. They simply issued an invoice. For the past 2 years, I had built a quiet, functional existence in the Silicon Desert. I stepped away from the reactive dynamic of my parents and my older sister. I paid my rent on time, managed my own routines, and asked them for nothing. Yet staring at that single line of text, I felt the old gravitational pull trying to drag me back into their orbit of crisis and demand. They wanted a first installment. They believed they were claiming their rightful share of my luck. What they did not know, and what I was legally barred from telling them, was that luck played 0 part in my current bank balance. The real source of my money was locked in a bottom drawer bound by black ink on heavy stock paper. I had not bought a lottery ticket. I had written a proprietary routing algorithm that a tech firm had quietly acquired. My phone buzzed a third time. My mother sent a red heart emoji. We know you will do the right thing for your sister. That little red heart was the heaviest thing on the screen. It was affection weaponized. It was a reminder that their love was always available for purchase, provided the check cleared by Friday. I set my phone face down on the desk. Explaining the truth would violate federal contracts. Ignoring them would only make them louder. I sat in the hum of the air conditioner and realized that reasoning with them was impossible. The only way out was to let them keep digging. The red heart emoji sat on my screen, a tiny digital weight pressing down on the afternoon. My mother had sent it like a signature sealing her command, with a symbol of affection that felt more like a threat. We know you will do the right thing for your sister. That phrase was the foundational operating system of my entire family. I left the phone face down on my desk, shifted my gaze to the pristine lines of code running on my primary monitor, and allowed myself to trace that specific sentence back to its source. My sister Vanessa is 28 years old, and she has spent the last decade building a life out of smoke and high-interest debt. She runs a boutique in Scottsdale called Desert Aura, a business that sells the aesthetics of a serene, untroubled life to women who have too much disposable income. Her shelves are lined with imported woven baskets, $80 organic linen shirts, and hand-poured candles that smell like sage and vanity. To her online followers, she is a successful entrepreneur, a lifestyle influencer living a curated Arizona dream. To me, she is a financial sinkhole, The boutique has never turned a genuine profit. The rent on her retail space is staggering, and her inventory is purchased on a revolving carousel of credit cards. When the margins shrink and the creditors call, she does not alter her business model. She calls our parents. Thomas and Brenda have always treated Vanessa less like a daughter and more like a fragile, high-risk investment they are terrified of abandoning. They view her constant financial crises as temporary setbacks on the road to her inevitable success. If Vanessa needs a cash injection to make payroll, they refinance their house. If she needs new fixtures for a seasonal display, they dip into their shrinking retirement accounts. They enable her with a fervor that borders on religious devotion. And then there is me. In the architecture of our family, if Vanessa is the delicate stained glass window, I am the load-bearing wall. I am the invisible workhorse. I put myself through college on scholarships and quiet, grueling hours writing code in the basement of the university library. I never asked for a loan. I never required a bailout. I learned very early that the surest way to maintain peace in my house was to require nothing from my parents, because all their resources were already spoken for. They did not view my independence as an achievement to be celebrated. They viewed it as a convenience. I was the safety net that required zero maintenance. A family trains you for the role they need you to play, and they had trained me to be the silent shock absorber for the turbulence Vanessa created. The first minor conflict of my adult life did not arrive with shouting. It arrived with an expectation of silent compliance. Sitting in my air-conditioned office, looking at the amber glow of my monitors, I remembered a Tuesday afternoon 2 years prior. It was the memory that finally broke the illusion I had carried about my place in their lives. I was 21, fresh out of college, working my first junior developer job. My phone had buzzed with a message from Vanessa. It was not a greeting. It was a link to the Arizona Department of Transportation website, followed by a short string of text. My tags are expired, and they are threatening to tow my car from the boutique lot. I am tapped out until Friday. Handle this. There was no question mark. There was no please, just an instruction. I clicked the link. The registration fee, including the late penalties she had accrued by ignoring the notices for 6 months, came to $400. At 21, $400 was a significant portion of my biweekly paycheck. It was grocery money. It was the buffer in my checking account. I sat at a different desk in a different office, staring at the state portal. I remember the exact texture of my cheap plastic debit card as I pulled it from my wallet. I remember typing the 16 digits into the payment field, rationalizing the sacrifice. I told myself that family steps in when things get hard. I told myself that she would pay me back on Friday, just as she promised. I clicked submit. The confirmation screen appeared, bathed in the blue light of my monitor. I sent Vanessa the confirmation number. I waited for the reply. I waited for a simple thank you, a digital acknowledgement that I had solved her crisis and kept her car from being impounded. The reply never came. Friday arrived and the money was not transferred. Weeks turned into months and the $400 was never mentioned again. When I finally brought it up to my mother over a brief holiday phone call, her voice took on a sharp, scolding tone. She told me that Vanessa was under a lot of pressure with the boutique, that I had a good salary, and that keeping score was a petty habit. That specific memory, sharp and unyielding, crystallized in my mind. It was the pebble that started the avalanche. I realized in that moment that they did not love me. They loved what I could quietly absorb for them. They loved my utility. I was not a person with my own needs limits or financial boundaries. I was a tool they could pick up when they needed to fix Vanessa and put back in the drawer when the job was done. This realization was the heavy, crushing boulder that explained everything happening right now. It explained the text messages demanding an RV deposit. My entire role in this family had been defined by my utility. Now that they believed I had stumbled into a fortune, their sense of entitlement was not an anomaly. It was the logical conclusion of the dynamic they had built over 2 decades. They did not see a daughter who had just achieved something remarkable. They saw a bank vault that had accidentally been left unlocked. They felt entitled to my perceived wealth because they felt entitled to me. I belonged to the family ecosystem, which meant my assets belonged to the ecosystem, which meant they belonged to Vanessa. I picked up my paper coffee cup and took a slow sip. The liquid was cold and bitter. I was no longer the 21-year-old girl who typed her card numbers into a state portal out of a misplaced sense of duty. I had spent the last 2 years quietly uncoupling myself from their machinery. I had stopped answering the urgent calls. I had stopped fronting the small holds. I had learned to protect my peace by removing my availability. Yet the demands had returned, magnified by an order of magnitude. A few $100s had mutated into a demand for millions. The sheer audacity of the shift required an explanation. Why today? Why, after months of minimal contact, had they suddenly concluded that I was harboring a secret fortune? I had recently paid off $60,000 in student loans, a transaction handled quietly through my banking portal. I had also traded in my failing college sedan for a reliable, slightly used hybrid vehicle. These were the actions of a professional securing her foundation, not a high roller spending reckless cash. I had not posted about it. I had not bragged. Someone had to have noticed the new car, or perhaps a piece of stray mail regarding the loan payoff had reached my parents' address. But a used car and a zeroed-out loan balance do not equal a luxury recreational vehicle and a demand for a first installment. There was a missing variable in this equation. Something had acted as a catalyst, warping their perception of reality and weaponizing their entitlement into a coordinated attack. My phone vibrated against the desk. The short, sharp buzz broke the silence of my workspace. I did not want to look, but the discipline of an auditor demands that you examine the data no matter how unpleasant. I reached out and turned the device over. The screen was filled with a notification from our dormant family group chat. Vanessa had bypassed the individual text thread and gone straight to the collective forum. She had not sent a message, she had sent an image. I tapped the notification, opening the chat application. A screenshot expanded to fill the display. It was a still frame captured from a local Phoenix news broadcast. The bright red banner at the bottom of the image featured breaking news text hovering above a picture of a generic convenience store storefront. I read the headline in the screenshot once, and then I read it again, feeling the blood drain from my face as the pieces of their delusion snapped together with terrifying precision. The image expanded on my display, filling the screen with the crisp graphics of a local Phoenix news broadcast. The banner at the bottom of the shot featured bold yellow lettering hovering over footage of a generic convenience store storefront out on Ray Road. The text read, "Anonymous Maricopa County resident claims $4.2 million jackpot." Below the headline, the station had listed the exact zip code where the winning ticket was sold. It was my zip code. I sat in the amber glow of my monitors and read the headline 3 times. The pieces of their delusion snapped together with terrifying precision. They had built an entire alternate reality out of a geographic coincidence and 2 quiet financial moves I had made earlier that month. 2 weeks prior, my ancient college sedan had finally surrendered, blowing a head gasket on the Loop 202 freeway. I required reliable transportation for my commute to the co-working space. I purchased a slate gray, slightly used hybrid vehicle. It was a pragmatic choice, efficient and unassuming. I drove it to a brief, obligatory Sunday lunch at my parents' house in Scottsdale. During that same lunch, my father tossed a piece of misdelivered mail across the dining table. It was a final confirmation letter from my loan servicer. $60,000 of educational debt reduced to a balance of 0. I had brushed off his inquiry, murmuring something vague about a favorable restructuring program. I wanted to avoid a prolonged discussion about my finances. My father had smiled his tight, calculating smile, sliding his gaze from the letter on the table to the pristine hybrid parked in his driveway. He filed those details away. Then he saw the evening news. The local lottery winner had claimed their prize on a Thursday. I brought the new hybrid to lunch on a Sunday. To a man searching for a bailout, that timeline was not a coincidence. It was a confession. The family group chat did not contain a single question. There was no inquiry asking if I had purchased the winning ticket. There was no gentle probing to verify the facts. The boulder hurtling toward me was the sheer, breathtaking momentum of their assumptions. They bypassed curiosity and landed immediately on entitlement, moving straight to the division of assets. The messages scrolled up my screen in a rapid, dizzying barrage, a digital feeding frenzy unfolding in real time. My father initiated the assault. "That explains the new car. You thought you could hide this from us." Vanessa followed seconds later. I need $400,000 by next month, or the commercial landlord is locking the boutique doors. You can afford it now. Do not be selfish. My father typed another demand before I could even process my sister's invoice. I have the brochures for the luxury motor coach. We are looking at $250,000 for the base model. It is the least you can do after everything we've provided for you growing up. Do not pretend you do not owe us, Vanessa added. I know you saw the news. We all know. They were allocating capital that did not exist in the way they imagined. They had drawn up a budget for my life without consulting me, carving out chunks of a phantom jackpot to plug the holes in their own sinking ships. To them, I was not a daughter or a sister who had experienced a life-changing event. I was a piggy bank they were shaking until the coins fell out upon the table. Then came my mother's contribution. Brenda had been silent during the initial barrage, waiting for the raw demands to settle before applying the emotional sealant. Her message appeared at the bottom of the thread, sitting alone in a pale gray bubble. "We know you will do the right thing for your sister." She appended a single pixelated red heart emoji to the end of the sentence. That tiny digital heart was the most chilling detail in the entire exchange. It was a masterclass in weaponized affection. My mother did not yell. She did not threaten. She framed their extortion as a moral imperative. By her logic, if I surrendered the cash, I was a good, loyal daughter, upholding the family bond. If I refused, I was a monster, hoarding millions while my own sister faced financial ruin. She used a symbol of love to enforce a shakedown, wrapping a naked demand for cash in the soft velvet of maternal expectation. I pushed my chair back from the desk. The industrial air conditioner cycled on, sending a steady rush of cold air against the back of my neck. The hum of the ventilation system felt incredibly loud in the silence of my workspace. I could type a reply. I could tap the glass keyboard and tell them the truth. I could explain that I had never set foot in that specific convenience store. I had never purchased a scratch-off ticket or a Powerball entry in my entire life. But telling the truth meant explaining the algorithm. It meant revealing the proprietary logistics routing software I had coded during long, solitary nights in my apartment. It meant disclosing that a major technology conglomerate expanding into the Silicon Desert had quietly acquired my software for a sum that happened to mirror the lottery payout. Most importantly, it meant violating a corporate non-disclosure agreement tied to a federal logistics contract. The ink on that heavy stock paper in my bottom drawer was barely dry. The legal stipulations were ironclad. If I disclosed the terms of the buyout, the acquisition amount, or the nature of the software integration before the 6-month blackout period expired, the tech firm would nullify the contract. Their legal department would sue me for breach of confidentiality, draining the very funds my family was trying to steal. I would lose everything I had built. Even if the legal restrictions did not exist, the truth carried its own unique danger. If my parents and Vanessa believed I won the lottery, they viewed the money as unearned luck. Lottery winnings belong to the universe, a random strike of lightning, and therefore, in their minds, the money belonged to the family collective. They felt entitled to a share of my good fortune. But if they discovered I had earned that wealth through grueling intellectual labor discipline and skill, their reaction would not be pride. It would be resentment. They would still demand the money, but they would demand it with the bitter fury of people who realize they have been outperformed by the child they designated as the invisible workhorse. They would hate me for achieving a level of success they could never replicate, and they would punish me for proving that their financial failures were the result of their own choices, not bad luck. Telling them I built $1 million asset would shatter the delicate hierarchy of our family. It would prove that the quiet, compliant safety net was actually the strongest person in the room. I stared at the screen grab of the local news broadcast. The bright yellow text glared back at me, letting them believe the lie protected my corporate contract. It kept the lawyers at bay, but embracing their delusion meant I was about to navigate a minefield of their escalating demands without a shield. I rested my hands on my lap, feeling the vibration of another incoming text, and realized that explaining the truth would detonate my professional life, but keeping the secret was about to put me in the crosshairs of my own blood. I reached down to the bottom drawer of my desk. The brushed metal handle felt cool against my palm. I turned the small brass key, pulled the track open, and looked at the blue presentation folder resting flat on the steel bottom. Inside that folder lay 50 pages of heavy stock paper. I knew the exact weight of it. I had felt the dense, textured grain in my hands when I signed my name in sharp black ink 3 weeks ago. That physical stack of corporate contracts sat in stark contrast to the weightless, frantic digital demands flooding my phone. Yet it was the sole item keeping me anchored to reality. My parents and my sister were demanding a share of a fantasy. I was guarding an empirical fact. My family operated on the firm belief that I had walked into a local convenience store, handed over a crisp dollar bill, and allowed a machine to select 6 random numbers. They thought I had scratched off a silver coating with the edge of a coin and waited for the universe to blindly hand me a fortune. To them, the money was a cosmic accident. It was unearned, unmerited, and therefore it belonged to the collective family unit. I am a software engineer. I do not believe in luck. I believe in logic, clean syntax, and finding the most efficient route between 2 data points. For 18 months, while my sister posted curated photographs of imported woven baskets and my parents refinanced their mortgage to fund her failing retail inventory, I worked. I spent my days designing user interfaces for a mid-tier logistics company, earning a modest salary. I spent my nights staring at complex data sets in the isolation of my small Chandler apartment. I had noticed a profound inefficiency in how local delivery routes were mapped across the sprawling, sun-baked grid of the Phoenix metropolitan area. The existing software was bloated, routing delivery drivers through high-traffic bottlenecks during peak afternoon hours, wasting fuel and delaying regional shipments. I did not complain about it. I decided to build a better system. I wrote a back-end routing algorithm from scratch. I fed the learning model years of traffic patterns, municipal highway expansion plans, and localized weather data. I spent weekends debugging endless lines of code, drinking cold water, and mapping theoretical delivery routes on a whiteboard until my hands ached. I created a predictive framework that optimized delivery networks in real time, anticipating traffic shifts before they occurred. I did not build it to become wealthy. I built it because the inefficiency annoyed me, and fixing broken systems is the only way I know how to navigate the world. A major technology conglomerate establishing a sprawling new data center down the highway in the Silicon Desert caught wind of a pilot test I ran on a localized server. They did not want to compete with my algorithm. They wanted to own the underlying architecture. The acquisition process was swift, cold, and ruthlessly corporate. Executives flew in from San Jose. We sat in a sleek, glass-walled conference room in downtown Phoenix, and they slid a binding offer across the table. The purchase price for the intellectual property rights to my software was $4.2 million. It was the exact same figure the local news anchor reported on the evening broadcast regarding the anonymous Maricopa County lottery winner. The payout amounts matched down to the decimal point. My family had seized upon a statistical anomaly, combined it with the sight of my new hybrid car, and forged a delusion so strong it had become their undisputed truth. This was the agonizing dual reality I now inhabited. I possessed the precise sum of money they wanted, but I was legally gagged from explaining how I acquired it. The tech conglomerate had tied the purchase to a strict, non-negotiable, non-disclosure agreement. The contract mandated a 6-month blackout period. Their legal team was integrating my algorithm into a proprietary federal logistics bid, and any leak of the acquisition details would compromise their competitive advantage in a multi-billion-dollar government contract. The penalties for breaching the confidentiality clause were draconian. The language on that heavy stock paper was clear. If I told my parents the truth, if I showed them the bank transfer records to prove I did not win a game of chance, the tech firm would litigate. Their lawyers would freeze my accounts, nullify the purchase agreement, and pursue me for financial damages that would easily eclipse the original payout. I was trapped between my family's manufactured narrative and a corporate legal snare. I could not defend myself against their lottery delusion without triggering my own financial ruin. The bitter irony was that telling a lie was legally safer than claiming my own competence. If I admitted I built an asset from scratch, I would lose it. Furthermore, I knew exactly how my family would react to the truth. My parents have always preferred comfortable fantasies over difficult realities. When my father lost his middle management job a decade ago, he told our neighbors he took an early retirement. When Vanessa's first retail location closed due to unpaid rent, my mother hosted a dinner party and announced her daughter was pivoting to an exclusive online model. They curate their reality, filtering out any facts that challenge their status. If they discovered I had earned that wealth through grueling intellectual labor, their reaction would not be pride. They would view my success as a direct indictment of their own failures. Vanessa would hate me for achieving a level of financial security she could never replicate. Thomas would resent me for outperforming him. They would still demand the money, but they would demand it with the bitter fury of people who realize the child they designated as the invisible workhorse is actually the strongest person in the room. My phone screen darkened, then flared to life again. The frantic group chat notifications had slowed, replaced by a different kind of pressure. They realized I was not going to engage in a digital debate. Text messages can be ignored. Demands sent over a cellular network can be left on read. My parents understood that extracting capital requires leverage, and leverage is best applied in a physical space. A new message arrived. It was a direct text from my father, bypassing the communal thread. "We are done playing games over the phone. Meet us at the Sunrise Diner on Rural Road in 20 minutes. Do not make us come to your office and cause a scene." The Sunrise Diner was a busy, fluorescent-lit establishment where we used to eat cheap breakfasts on Sunday mornings during my childhood. By choosing a crowded public venue, my father was laying a trap. He knew I despised public spectacle. He knew my professional demeanor was my armor, and he calculated that I would surrender the funds quietly rather than risk a shouting match in front of 50 strangers eating pancakes. He was using my own discipline against me, cornering me in a booth where silence would look like guilt and arguing would look like madness. I closed the blue folder in my drawer, turned the brass key, and stood up from my desk. The digital skirmish was over. The physical confrontation was about to begin. The transition from the sterile quiet of my co-working space to the grease-scented chaos of the Sunrise Diner felt like crossing a physical border. The Arizona sun beat down on the cracked asphalt of the parking lot, radiating waves of intense heat that distorted the faded neon sign above the entrance. I parked my hybrid vehicle in a spot near the back, turned off the engine, and let the silence sit in the cabin for one final minute. Then, I unbuckled my seatbelt and walked into the trap my parents had set. The diner was a relic of a previous decade, filled with cracked red vinyl booths, sticky formica tables, and the clattering sound of fixed ceramic plates. It was the exact location where my father used to bring us for cheap pancake specials when his ambitious business ventures inevitably stalled. Choosing this specific restaurant was a calculated move. It was familiar territory, a place steeped in nostalgia, designed to soften my defenses and remind me of the family unit. I spotted them immediately. Thomas and Brenda were wedged into a corner booth near the kitchen doors. My father sat with his back straight, wearing a crisp polo shirt, looking uncharacteristically alert. My mother sat beside him, nervously smoothing a paper napkin flat against the tabletop. They looked less like parents waiting for their daughter and more like a hostile acquisition team preparing a boardroom presentation. I walked over and slid into the empty side of the booth. Neither of them offered a hug. Neither of them asked how my morning was going. The air between us was thick with an unearned anticipation. Before anyone could speak, a waitress with a stained apron and a tired expression arrived at our table, pulling a notepad from her pocket. She asked if we were ready to order. My father did not even look at the laminated menu. He leaned back against the red vinyl and smiled at the waitress. He ordered the ribeye steak and eggs, specifying that he wanted the largest cut they had in the kitchen. He added a side of loaded hash browns and a large, freshly squeezed orange juice. It was the most expensive combination the diner offered. He handed the menu back to the waitress and pointed a thumb in my direction. "Put it all on one check. My daughter is celebrating today. She is footing the bill." The waitress offered a polite, exhausted smile and turned to me. I ordered a black coffee. The sheer presumption of the moment anchored the reality of the situation. My father was a man who spent his entire adult life monitoring the cost of every item on a grocery receipt, complaining bitterly about the price of gasoline, and weaponizing his financial anxiety against his family. Now, armed with the false belief that I possessed a multi-million-dollar windfall, his frugality vanished. He was casually spending my money before I had even spoken a word. The waitress walked away, leaving us in a tense silence. The manufactured nostalgia of the diner evaporated. My father leaned forward, placing his elbows on the sticky table. He unzipped a worn leather portfolio he had resting beside his hip. He reached inside and pulled out a single sheet of crisp white printer paper. He did not ask for a favor. He did not plead for assistance. He slid the paper across the Formica table until it rested directly in front of me. I looked down. It was a printed spreadsheet. The document was meticulously formatted, complete with bolded headers and a calculated sum at the bottom. The title at the top read, Asset Allocation Plan. My eyes scanned the line items. The first block of text was dedicated entirely to Vanessa. The spreadsheet detailed the exact amount required to clear the commercial lease arrears on her failing Scottsdale boutique. Below that was a line for inventory replenishment, followed by a demand to pay off 3 separate high-interest credit cards held in Vanessa's name. The total capital allocated to my sister was just over $800,000. The second block was dedicated to my parents. The largest line item was listed simply as retirement vehicle. The requested amount was $450,000. My father had not been joking about the luxury motor coach. He was demanding a high-end diesel pusher recreational vehicle, treating it as a basic necessity. The rest of the page outlined a full payoff of their primary mortgage and a nebulous figure labeled living stipend. I looked at the bolded number at the very bottom of the page. The total requested sum was exactly $2.1 million. It was exactly half of the $4.2 million jackpot they believed I had won. The audacity of the printed paper took the breath out of the room. They had not come to congratulate me. They had come to manage an asset they sincerely believed they owned. They had convened a board meeting to distribute a dividend, and they had granted themselves a 50% controlling stake in my life. "We ran the numbers this morning," my father said, his voice adopting a calm, authoritative cadence. "After taxes, you should clear around $2.8 million from the lump sum option. Taking care of these items leaves you with $700,000. That is more than enough seed money for a girl your age to put into an index fund." He spoke with the unearned confidence of a seasoned financial advisor. He was allocating phantom funds, dictating my financial future, based on a television news banner and a profound sense of entitlement. My mother reached across the table and attempted to place her hand over mine. I pulled my hand back, letting her fingers land on the bare Formica. "We are just so proud of you, sweetheart," Brenda said, her voice dripping with a rehearsed, suffocating warmth. "This is a blessing for the whole family. You know how much Vanessa has been struggling. This is going to save her business. We can finally relax. We can all finally just breathe." I sat perfectly still, employing the exact same discipline I used when auditing a broken software script. I separated the emotion from the data. The emotional narrative they were pushing was one of family unity and shared salvation. The underlying data told a different story. The data showed 2 parents willing to bankrupt their youngest daughter to subsidize the perpetual failures of their oldest. I could not tell them the truth about the algorithm. The non-disclosure agreement locked in my desk drawer prohibited me from explaining that the $4.2 million was the result of a corporate buyout, not a lucky ticket. But staring at the spreadsheet, I realized that the truth would not change the outcome. If I violated federal contract law and showed them the corporate transfer documents, they would still look at this exact same spreadsheet. They did not care how the capital was generated. They only cared that the capital existed and that they had access to it. If they knew I earned the money through sheer competence, they would simply demand the $2.1 million as a penalty for being more successful than the golden child. They were trying to manufacture a sentimental moment, framing extortion as a beautiful family milestone. I refused to participate in the performance. I looked up from the spreadsheet and met my father's gaze. "I am not paying this," I said. My voice was quiet, level, and entirely devoid of emotion. The manufactured warmth vanished from my mother's face. My father's jaw tightened, the authoritative demeanor cracking to reveal a deep, simmering anger. "You are not listening to me, Lydia," my father said, his tone dropping an octave. "This is not a negotiation. You owe this family. We housed you. We raised you. You are going to write the transfer orders by Friday, or you will find out very quickly what happens when you turn your back on your own blood." The waitress arrived at that exact moment, carrying a heavy oval plate loaded with a thick ribeye steak, eggs, and a tall glass of orange juice. She set the feast down in front of my father, oblivious to the toxic atmosphere at the table. She placed my black coffee near the edge. Reasoning with them was impossible. They had built an alternate reality, installed themselves as the rulers of it, and decided my compliance was mandatory. Any further dialogue would only feed their delusion. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a $20 bill. I placed it on the table next to my untouched coffee cup. It was more than enough to cover the black coffee and leave a generous tip for the waitress who had to deal with them. I stood up from the vinyl booth. My father stared at the cash, then stared at me, a piece of steak halfway to his mouth. "Enjoy your lunch," I said. I turned and walked out of the diner, leaving the printed spreadsheet sitting next to the syrup dispenser. Pushing through the heavy glass doors into the blinding Arizona heat, I felt a cold certainty settle in my chest. My parents had failed to secure the funds through a boardroom presentation. That meant Vanessa was going to be deployed next, and she would not bother with a spreadsheet. The drive from the diner back to my apartment complex offered a brief window of air-conditioned isolation. I guided my hybrid vehicle down the wide, sun-drenched avenues of Chandler, navigating past stucco strip malls and glass-fronted corporate parks. I knew my departure from the restaurant would trigger a secondary response. My parents operated on a predictable hierarchy of escalation. When their attempt at paternal authority failed over steak and eggs, they would inevitably deploy their most volatile asset. I mentally prepared myself for the next phase of their extraction protocol. I turned into the gated entrance of my housing community and waited for the iron security barrier to slide open along its track. I parked in my assigned carport space, seeking a minor refuge in the narrow strip of shade provided by the corrugated metal roof. I turned off the ignition, gathered my keys, and opened the driver's side door. As my foot touched the hot pavement, the sharp, rhythmic sound of a high-heeled shoe striking the blacktop echoed across the empty parking lot. Vanessa was waiting for me. She stood blocking the concrete stairwell that led up to my second-floor unit. My older sister had clearly abandoned the curated, serene persona she maintained for her retail customers. Her posture was rigid, and her jaw was set in a tight, uncompromising line. The fierce desert heat was already causing her meticulous makeup to soften, but she paid no attention to the discomfort. She had driven directly from Scottsdale the moment our parents informed her that their boardroom presentation had collapsed. I stopped walking, maintaining a deliberate physical distance between us. My eyes naturally tracked to the object she held clutched tight against her ribs. It was a pristine, cream-colored designer handbag featuring heavy gold hardware that caught the blinding afternoon sunlight. The retail price for that specific imported accessory hovered around $3,000. I knew with mathematical certainty that she had purchased it using a revolving credit account she lacked the capital to pay off. She squeezed the buttery leather with white-knuckled fingers, wielding a luxury status symbol while preparing to beg for a financial rescue. "You walked out on them," Vanessa said. Her voice lacked the saccharine sweetness she usually employed when asking for a favor. It was sharp and guttural, carrying across the rows of parked cars. "Dad called me from the restaurant. You left a 20 on the table and walked away while they were trying to save my business." I did not offer a defense. I stood under the metal awning and watched her chest heave with indignation. Defending my actions would imply that her premise was valid, and I refused to engage with a manufactured reality. "You are hoarding millions of dollars," Vanessa shouted, taking a sudden step forward. The sound bounced off the stucco walls of the surrounding buildings. "Do you have any idea what kind of stress I am under? The commercial landlord sent a final eviction notice yesterday. My wholesale vendors are threatening collections. I am drowning here, Lydia, and you are sitting on a fortune, holding out on your own flesh and blood." The hypocrisy of her statement was staggering. She was wearing the equivalent gross domestic product of a small island nation on her arm, lecturing me about financial ruin. I observed her erratic movements with clinical detachment. For years, I had absorbed her anxiety. I had written the checks to clear her late registration fees and nodded sympathetically when she blamed macroeconomic trends for her poor inventory decisions. Now, armed with the assumption that I had won a jackpot, she felt entitled to drop the Victim Act and play the role of a righteous creditor demanding immediate payment. When my silence stretched on, Vanessa shifted her tactics. The emotional extortion morphed into a calculated modern threat. She realized that guilt was not an effective lever, so she reached for public humiliation. "You think you can just ignore us and hide in your little tech bubble?" she sneered, pulling her smartphone out from the designer bag. "You think you are so untouchable because you write code for a living. I have 30,000 followers, Lydia. I know half the marketing directors in the Silicon Desert. I know the event coordinators and the local startup founders. I have built a network while you were hiding behind a screen." She tapped the glass display of her device, holding it up like a weapon. "I will go live right now from this parking lot. I will tell the entire Phoenix tech community exactly what kind of person you are. I will tell them you won a $4 million jackpot and left your family to starve. I will tag your shared workspace. I will tag every software firm in the valley. We will see how hireable you are when everyone knows you are a greedy, disloyal traitor." She intended to weaponize her digital platform to destroy my professional reputation, leveraging public shame to force a private payout. A younger version of me might have panicked. I might have pleaded with her to keep my name off the internet, terrified of the social and professional fallout. A public smear campaign could disrupt a career, causing potential employers to view the candidate as a liability. However, my training as an engineer compelled me to analyze the structural integrity of her threat. If she went live and broadcasted a narrative about a lottery win, she would actually be fortifying my cover story. The corporate lawyers enforcing my non-disclosure agreement would not care about a fabricated rumor regarding a game of chance. Their sole concern was protecting the intellectual property of the algorithm. By screaming about a jackpot, Vanessa was volunteering to build a thicker smokescreen around the very corporate secret I was legally bound to protect. She was threatening to ruin me with a lie that actually kept me safe. I let my gaze travel from her frantic eyes down to the pristine leather handbag and back up again. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her chaotic energy. I employed the most disarming tactic available in a high-conflict negotiation. I offered a calm, observational fact. "Your phone is at 10% battery, Vanessa," I said quietly. "You should probably charge it before you ruin my life." Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. She had expected me to crumble. She had anticipated a tearful apology or a desperate counteroffer. My calm refusal to engage short-circuited her entire strategy. She stared at me, her face flushing a deep mottled red, realizing that the old rules of engagement no longer applied. Her weaponized entitlement held no power over a target that refused to flinch. I stepped around her, walked up the concrete stairs, and unlocked my front door. I stepped inside the cool, quiet space of my apartment and closed the door, leaving her standing alone in the suffocating heat of the parking lot. I engaged the deadbolt, securing the physical boundary between us. The quiet of my living room offered a temporary sanctuary, but the conflict had not ended. It had merely been pushed to its breaking point. I walked into the kitchen and poured a glass of cold water. 10 minutes later, a notification chimed from my laptop resting on the granite counter. It was not a text message. It was a formal, multi-recipient email. The sender was my father, with Vanessa and my mother copied on the thread. The subject line was blank. I opened the document and read the contents. The text was brief, coordinated, and stripped of any lingering pretense of family affection. It outlined a final, unified demand. They required the $2.1 million transferred into a joint account by 5 o'clock on Friday. If the funds did not arrive, the email stated, they would take permanent, irreversible action to cut me out of their lives forever. The extortion had evolved from a shouted threat in a parking lot into a documented formal ultimatum. The email glowed on my kitchen counter, a digital contract offering me a choice between my financial future and my family. The terms were laid out in black text on a stark white screen devoid of any familial warmth. Transfer $2.1 million by Friday at 5 o'clock or forfeit my position in their lives. The threat was explicit. I stood in the quiet of my apartment, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, processing the reality that my parents had just reduced our entire relationship to a ransom note. Before the screen could even dim to sleep mode, my phone began to ring. The caller identification displayed my father's name. They were not going to wait for a written response. They wanted to hear the surrender in my voice. They needed the auditory confirmation that their extortion had worked. I picked up the device and pressed the green icon, bringing the speaker to my ear. I did not say hello. "Lydia," my father said. His voice was clipped, carrying the harsh metallic echo of a speakerphone. My mother was sitting right beside him. "You read the email?" "I read it," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level. "Then you understand the position you have placed us in," he continued, shifting the blame with practiced ease. "We did not want it to come to this. We hoped you would see reason at the diner. We hoped you would recognize your obligations to the people who raised you. But since you want to act like a stranger, we will treat you like one." My mother leaned closer to their microphone. The rehearsed, suffocating warmth she had used at the restaurant was entirely gone. Her voice was brittle, stripped down to its cold foundation. "If that transfer does not clear your sister's accounts by Friday evening, you are no longer a part of this family. Do you understand what that means, Lydia? You will not come to Thanksgiving. You will not call us on birthdays. If you have an emergency, you will not dial our numbers. We will erase you." The words hung in the air, transmitted across cell towers, and routed into the silence of my living room. "We will erase you." It was the ultimate emotional blackmail, the nuclear option in their arsenal of manipulation. For a child raised to be the invisible safety net, the threat of total abandonment is designed to be a lethal strike. It is supposed to buckle the knees. It is supposed to trigger a desperate, tearful apology and an immediate capitulation. As I listened to the faint static on the line, my mind did not rush toward panic. Instead, it drifted back to the final moments at the Sunrise Diner earlier that afternoon. After I had placed the $20 bill on the Formica table to cover my coffee and the waitress's tip, I had turned and walked toward the exit. But before I could push through the heavy glass doors, the restaurant manager had intercepted me at the front register. He held a printed receipt, looking uncomfortable. My father had flagged him down from the booth, pointing a finger at my retreating back, loudly declaring that his daughter was handling the main tab. I could have argued. I could have caused a scene, shouting across the crowded dining room that the man in the corner booth needed to pay for his own extravagant meal. Instead, I had opened my wallet and retrieved my debit card. It was a standard entry-level bank issue, the plastic edges scuffed and peeling, from years of careful, calculated use. It was not the sleek metal card of a millionaire. I slid the worn plastic into the chip reader. I watched the digital display ask for a tip amount. The ribeye steak, the loaded hash browns, and the fresh juice totaled $38.42. I typed 0.00 on the gratuity line, knowing I had already compensated the waitress with the cash left at the table. I authorized the exact total, $38.42. I paid for his meal to the exact penny, ensuring I did not owe him a single fraction of a cent, and ensuring I did not give him a fraction of a cent more than required. That scuffed piece of plastic and the exact mathematics of that transaction crystallized in my memory as I held the phone to my ear. That receipt was the perfect metaphor for my entire existence in their household. I was expected to cover the heavy costs, to zero out their deficits, while receiving nothing but the bill. "Are you listening to me?" my father demanded over the speakerphone, his patience fraying. "We will cut you out, Lydia. You will have no one." The boulder shifted. The crushing weight of their expectations cracked, fracturing down the middle, and fell away. A profound, expansive wave of grief washed over me, but it was not the grief of losing them. It was the grief of realizing I was mourning an illusion. I was grieving the parents I deserved, not the parents currently speaking to me on the phone. What they were threatening to take away was their conditional love, and conditional love is just a transaction disguised as affection. You cannot lose something you never actually possessed. They were threatening to revoke my access to a family dynamic that only existed to drain me. They were promising to relieve me of the burden of my sister's debt, my father's financial anxiety, and my mother's weaponized guilt. They believed they were condemning me to isolation. In reality, they were handing me the keys to my own freedom. I took a slow, deep breath. The air in my apartment felt lighter, scrubbed clean of the lingering obligation that had choked my throat for 23 years. I looked at the dark screen of my laptop on the counter, knowing the exact balance of my accounts and the ironclad nature of the corporate non-disclosure agreement in my desk. I knew who I was, what I had built, and what I was worth. "Lydia," my mother snapped, her voice tightening with desperation. "Answer us! Will you send the money?" I held the phone steady. I did not justify my decision. I did not explain the logistics, routing algorithm, or the corporate buyout. I did not remind them of the expired car registration I had paid or the countless other silent rescues I had performed over the years. Giving them an explanation would imply that this was a negotiation, and a negotiation implies that they still held leverage. "No," I said. It was a single syllable dropped into the center of the call with the heavy final thud of a vault door locking shut. For 3 long seconds, there was absolute silence on the line. The quiet was so dense, it felt physical. I could picture them sitting at their kitchen table, staring at the phone, their faces frozen in shock as the reality of my refusal registered. The invisible workhorse had just kicked down the stall. My father drew a breath to speak, likely to unleash a torrent of rage, but I did not wait to hear the syllables form. I moved my thumb, tapped the red icon on my screen, and severed the connection. The call ended. The silence in my apartment returned whole and undisturbed. I placed the phone on the granite countertop and walked over to the window, looking out at the darkened Arizona landscape. The streetlights flickered to life, casting long shadows across the pavement. The emotional manipulation had failed. The guilt trips, the public ambushes, and the ultimatums had all shattered against a simple, quiet refusal. But as I watched a pair of headlights sweep across the complex parking lot, the calm in my chest hardened into vigilance. My family operated on desperation. They were drowning in debt, convinced a lottery fortune was sitting just out of reach. By taking away their emotional leverage, I had not ended the war. I had merely forced them to change their tactics. If they could not extract the money using words, they were going to look for proof using their hands. They had exhausted their psychological weapons, which meant they were about to cross a very real, very dangerous legal line. 2 days passed without a single incoming message, voicemail, or email. The digital silence radiating from my family was profound. I knew better than to interpret their quiet as a retreat. In the ecosystem of my relatives, silence was never a truce. It was a reloading phase. They had exhausted their repertoire of emotional leverage and issued their final ultimatum. When the deadline came and went without a wire transfer, they were forced to reevaluate their strategy. They believed I was holding a multi-million-dollar fortune, and desperate people do not simply walk away from a perceived jackpot. They changed their angle of approach. It was a Thursday morning and I was back at my desk in the Chandler workspace. I wore noise-canceling headphones immersed in a high-stakes coding sprint. The technology firm that purchased my logistics algorithm required a seamless integration of my back-end routing protocols into their servers before the end of the month. The work demanded an intense, granular level of focus. I was tracking data packets across multiple simulated delivery grids, optimizing the flow of information to eliminate micro-delays in the network. My mechanical keyboard clicked in a steady, unbroken rhythm. Then a sharp haptic pulse vibrated against my left wrist. I paused my typing. I glanced down at the smooth glass face of my smartwatch. The screen illuminated, displaying a motion alert from the security application linked to my apartment. I had mounted a small, unobtrusive camera above my front door a year ago to monitor package deliveries. My ground floor unit featured an exterior entrance, and the property management company had installed individual locking metal mailboxes, flush against the stucco wall, right next to every doorway. I tapped the notification on my wrist. The application mirrored the feed to my secondary desktop monitor. The video buffered for a fraction of a second before resolving into crisp 1080p definition. Vanessa was standing on my welcome mat. She was not alone. Her husband Jared stood beside her, surveying the empty parking lot over his shoulder. Jared was a man who spoke almost entirely in the borrowed vocabulary of hustle culture and decentralized finance. Despite driving a leased European sedan he could barely afford to fuel. He chased volatile margins on margin calls, pitching disruptive tech ventures that never materialized beyond a sleek slide deck. He and Vanessa were a perfectly matched pair, two people drowning in toxic debt while projecting the flawless aesthetics of wealth. If Vanessa was desperate to save her boutique, Jared was equally desperate to cover his over-leveraged market positions. A phantom lottery payout would look like a divine rescue to a man accustomed to gambling with capital he did not possess. Vanessa wore oversized dark sunglasses and a wide-brimmed sun hat. It was a theatrical attempt at anonymity that only made her look more conspicuous in the bright Arizona morning. She pointed a manicured finger at the aluminum mailbox mounted on the wall. Jared stepped forward. He reached into the pocket of his tailored trousers and produced a flathead screwdriver. I sat frozen in my ergonomic chair watching the feed in real time. The reality of their actions crystallized in my mind. They were convinced I had won the Arizona lottery. They assumed the state commission mailed official correspondence tax documents, or perhaps the physical payout checks directly to my residential address. They had grown tired of waiting for me to surrender the funds. They had driven across the valley to harvest the proof themselves. Jared jammed the steel tip of the screwdriver into the narrow seam of the locked mailbox door. He braced his forearm against the stucco wall and applied downward pressure using the tool as a lever. The cheap aluminum frame resisted for a moment, then yielded. A sharp metallic snap echoed through the camera's audio feed as the locking mechanism fractured. The small metal door popped open, swinging loosely on its bottom hinge. They had just committed a felony. The United States Postal Service treats the destruction of a mailbox and the theft of mail as federal offenses. My sister and her husband had crossed the line, separating emotional extortion from undeniable documented criminal behavior. They were risking federal indictment out of sheer unadulterated greed. Vanessa shoved Jared aside the moment the door dropped open. She plunged her hands into the narrow compartment, her fingers clawing at the contents. She was hunting for heavy stock envelopes bearing official government seals. She was searching for the tangible evidence of a fortune that did not exist. The modern irony of the moment washed over me, crisp and undeniable. I was sitting in a sterile, air-conditioned tech incubator, managing the final integration phases of a proprietary asset that had legitimately earned me millions. Meanwhile, displayed on a glowing rectangle of pixels right beside my code editor, my sister and her husband were standing on a concrete landing, committing a low-tech crime with a $5 hardware tool. They were risking years in a federal penitentiary to steal water bills and grocery store circulars. The camera broadcasted their frantic desperation in unblinking high-definition clarity. My pulse remained steady. I did not reach for my cell phone to dial emergency services. Dispatching the local police would result in an immediate patrol response and an ugly public arrest on my doorstep. I required silence and control, not sirens and flashing lights. Calling the authorities would hand the narrative over to the state, turning a private advantage into a public spectacle. I moved my cursor across the monitor. I opened the security application dashboard on my desktop and clicked the export icon. I routed the live video file directly to a secure, encrypted cloud folder. I watched the progress bar fill rapidly, capturing the fractured lock, Jared's clear facial profile, and Vanessa's frantic hands. I was no longer just a target enduring their harassment. I was an archivist. I was gathering the undeniable receipts, building a fortress of evidence they could not argue against, gaslight, or deny. On the video feed, Vanessa pulled a handful of paper from the metal box. She rifled through the envelopes, tearing through the junk mail and promotional flyers. Her rapid movements began to slow as the reality of the empty hall settled over her. There were no commission checks. There were no bank drafts. There was nothing but the mundane correspondence of a normal life. She threw the useless stack of paper onto the doormat in a sudden fit of rage. The envelopes scattered across the concrete. She spun around, her face twisting in frustration beneath the oversized sunglasses, and stomped down the walkway toward the parking lot. Jared lingered for a brief second, glancing nervously at the broken aluminum door hanging off its hinge before turning and jogging after his wife. The feed recorded their retreat until they disappeared from the frame. I closed the application and stared at the empty screen. The physical search had failed. They had crossed a dangerous boundary, destroyed federal property, and emerged with zero leverage. That failure would not prompt a retreat. It would infuriate my parents. Realizing they could not steal the proof, they would inevitably seek a disastrously aggressive new method to force my hand. They would stop trying to find the money in the shadows and attempt to drag the phantom fortune into the light, fabricating a weapon they believed I could not ignore. The fluorescent lights of the Chandler co-working space cast a sterile, even glow across the surface of my desk. I was deep in the final stages of data packet encryption, tracing virtual delivery routes across a simulated map of the valley, when a shadow fell over my mechanical keyboard. The front desk receptionist stood beside my chair, holding a rigid cardboard envelope and a digital signature pad. She pointed a stylus at the screen, indicating where I needed to sign for a piece of certified mail. I traced my name on the glass, took the heavy envelope, and waited for her to walk away before inspecting the return address label. The printed sticker did not feature the sleek, minimalist branding typical of the corporate tech firms I communicated with daily. The sender was listed as the law offices of Gary Trenton. A quick search on my phone revealed the firm was located in an aging strip mall, situated between a discount mattress warehouse and a payday loan storefront on the dusty outskirts of Mesa. My family had exhausted their emotional leverage with the phone call. They had failed in their attempt at physical intimidation when Vanessa and Jared broke into my mailbox and found nothing. Now, running out of options and desperate to access a fortune they believed was slipping through their fingers, they had pooled their resources to hire a gun. I slid my thumb under the adhesive flap and tore the cardboard open. The rough sound of tearing paper seemed exceptionally loud in the quiet workspace. Inside rested 3 pages of standard lightweight printer paper, fastened in the top left corner with a single staple. The document smelled faintly of cheap, overheated toner. The heavy, dark letterhead across the top of the first page was clearly designed to intimidate the recipient, but my eyes immediately caught a glaring typographical error in the subtitle. The text proudly proclaimed, "Mr. Trenton as an expert in civil litigation." The missing vowel sat right in the center of the word, a quiet, undeniable monument to incompetence. That single misspelled word perfectly encapsulated the stark contrast between my reality and their attack. I spent my days writing flawless lines of code, operating in an environment where a single misplaced semicolon or a broken string of text would crash an entire logistics routing system. My professional world demanded perfection logic and rigorous testing. My parents had launched an extortion campaign using a discount attorney who did not bother to run a basic spell check on his own primary business stationery. I smoothed the pages flat on my desk and began to read. The document was a formal cease and desist notice, coupled with a threat of an impending civil lawsuit. As I parsed the dense legal jargon, the true nature of their new strategy revealed itself. They were no longer simply demanding a share of a supposed lottery win out of a vague sense of familial obligation. They had constructed a fabricated legal narrative to claim formal ownership of the money. According to the letter, my father alleged that on the Sunday afternoon prior to the lottery drawing, he had handed me a crisp $10 bill. The document claimed he provided this specific currency with explicit instructions for me to purchase 2 random number tickets at the convenience store located on my standard route home. Furthermore, the lawyer stated that Thomas and I had entered into a verbal contract right there in his driveway, cementing a binding partnership agreement to split any potential winnings equally. The narrative was a total, breathtaking fiction. My father had never handed me cash for any reason since my early teenage years. On the Sunday in question, I had paid for my own fuel, bought my own groceries, and spent the evening alone in my apartment debugging my algorithm. He had taken a geographic coincidence, my zip code matching the winning location broadcast on the news, and retroactively engineered a detailed, specific history to insert himself into a financial transaction that never occurred. The letter accused me of breach of fiduciary duty fraud and the unlawful concealment of shared assets. It demanded that I freeze all capital transfers and immediately remit $2.1 million to the trust account of Mr. Trenton pending a final settlement, threatening to seek emergency injunctive relief if I failed to comply. I sat back in my mesh chair and stared at the white acoustic tiles on the ceiling. The sheer delusion required to draft this document was staggering. They had not just misunderstood a series of coincidental events, they had sat in a room with a licensed attorney and woven a deliberate, calculated lie, treating the justice system as just another tool for extraction. This tactic aligned perfectly with my father's history. Thomas always viewed the law as a mechanism for quick payouts rather than a system of justice. Years ago, he hired an independent contractor to repair a minor section of our residential roof. When the worker accidentally left a small grease scuff on the driveway pavement, my father threatened a devastating lawsuit for property damage. He bullied the frightened man into waiving the entire labor fee just to make the legal threat stop. My father viewed lawsuits as a magic wand that forced people to surrender cash to avoid a headache. He was attempting to deploy the exact same strategy against his own daughter. He believed the threat of a prolonged, expensive court battle would terrify me. He calculated that I would look at the impending legal fees and the stress of a public trial and simply hand over a portion of the jackpot to make the problem disappear quietly. The heavy boulder rolling toward me was the realization of how far they were willing to go to take what was not theirs. They were willing to perjure themselves. They were willing to sign sworn affidavits detailing a conversation that never happened. They were willing to commit fraud upon the court to steal a prize they had zero hand in creating. My first instinct, born from 2 decades of trying to mitigate family crises and correct their errors, was to pick up my smartphone. I wanted to call the phone number printed on the flawed letterhead, demand to speak with this Gary Trenton, and tell him the truth. I wanted to inform him that his clients were delusional, that there was no winning ticket, and that the fortune in question was the result of a corporate software buyout bound by a strict non-disclosure agreement. I wanted to present the factual data and watch their fabricated case disintegrate. But as my fingers brushed the edge of my phone, I stopped. The facts would not save me. If I called that strip mall office and explained the underlying routing algorithm, my father would simply pivot. The moment he learned the money came from a tech conglomerate, he would rewrite his fiction to fit the new reality. He would suddenly claim he funded my early computer equipment, or that he paid a vital portion of my rent during the software development phase. He would create a new, equally false partnership agreement to claim the intellectual property rights. If my family realized the wealth was generated by my own intelligence and discipline, their greed would only intensify, fueled by a bitter resentment that I had outsmarted them. Telling the truth would violate my corporate contract and give them the exact information they needed to refine their attack. Explaining reality to people committed to a delusion is a fatal tactical error. It merely provides them with fresh ammunition to use against you. I looked down at the misspelled word in the letterhead again. The chaotic grift of my family was staring me in the face, operating on false assumptions and blatant lies. They were blindly swinging a weapon in the dark, certain they had cornered a lottery winner. I realized then that the most powerful response was no response at all. If I attempted to correct their narrative, I would be fighting on their terms, playing defense against an ever-shifting set of lies. I had to let them continue building this fictional partnership. I had to let them file the official paperwork, sign the legal declarations, and lock themselves into a story that was structurally unsound. They believed they were setting a brilliant legal trap for a disloyal daughter. They had no idea they were weaving a snare for themselves. I folded the 3 pages of cheap printer paper along their original creases, slid them back into the torn cardboard envelope, and placed the entire package in my bottom desk drawer. I laid it right next to the blue folder containing my heavy stock corporate buyout contract. The stage was set, and I was going to let them perform their lie all the way to the very end. The following morning, I bypassed my usual route to the shared workspace. I navigated my hybrid vehicle onto the westbound freeway, driving toward the towering glass and steel structures of downtown Phoenix. The discount attorney my parents had retained operated out of a fading sun-bleached plaza on the outskirts of town. I required a defender who navigated the high-stakes reality of corporate litigation. Using a fractional sliver of the initial capital transfer from my software buyout, I had secured a consultation with a senior partner at a premier Arizona law firm. The elevator carried me to the 34th floor. The reception area was an expanse of brushed steel, polished concrete, and frosted glass, exuding a quiet, unshakable authority. A receptionist offered me sparkling water and escorted me into a corner conference room featuring a panoramic view of the Sonoran Desert. David Caldwell entered a moment later. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and carried a pristine legal pad. He was a man who dismantled complex financial disputes for a living, and his demeanor was clinical, efficient, and precise. I sat across from him and opened my leather briefcase. I produced the flimsy cardboard envelope containing the cease and desist notice from Gary Trenton. I slid the 3 pages of cheap printer paper across the polished mahogany table. Caldwell picked up the document. He scanned the fabricated allegations regarding a crisp $10 bill and a fictional verbal contract. He noticed the glaring typographical error in the letterhead, and a faint, knowing smirk touched the corner of his mouth. He set the paper down with the delicate care one might use when handling a piece of fragile trash. Next, I retrieved the blue presentation folder. I placed it on the table. I explained that I was bound by a federal non-disclosure agreement, but attorney-client privilege provided a safe harbor to discuss the contents. I slid the heavy stock paper toward him. Caldwell reviewed the corporate acquisition contract, verifying the purchase price for my proprietary routing algorithm and the strict 6-month confidentiality clause enforced by the acquiring technology conglomerate. Caldwell closed the blue folder and intertwined his fingers on the desk. He did not advise me to draft a vigorous rebuttal. He did not suggest calling opposing counsel to clarify the facts or demand an apology. He looked at me and explained the profound difference between an internal emotional instinct and an external legal strategy. My internal instinct was to correct the lie, to defend my character, and to stop the harassment immediately. His external strategy was to allow the opposition to sprint blindly toward a brick wall. He detailed the mechanics of the impending snare. My parents and their strip mall lawyer were currently operating on assumptions, building a case on a foundation of air. If I corrected their narrative, I would educate them. I would reveal the existence of the tech conglomerate, allowing my father to pivot his extortion attempt. Thomas would inevitably drop the lottery fiction and invent a new lie, claiming he funded my early computer equipment or provided essential capital during the software development phase. Warning them would only help them refine their attack. Caldwell advised me to embrace a total freeze. We would not acknowledge the cease and desist notice. We would not answer their phone calls. We would wait for them to officially file the civil lawsuit with the county clerk. By forcing them to initiate formal litigation without any pushback, we were inviting them to commit their fiction to the permanent legal record. My father would have to sign a sworn affidavit detailing the imaginary convenience store transaction under penalty of perjury. He would have to lie to a judge, transforming a private family shakedown into a documented federal offense. This was the strategic weaponization of silence. I learned in that elevated conference room that the most devastating move on the board is often sitting perfectly still. You let the enemy exhaust their ammunition and lock themselves into a narrative they can never prove. I left the high-rise building with a deep, settling calm. The burden of defending myself had evaporated. I was no longer a victim reacting to a crisis. I was a participant in a calculated waiting game, holding the winning hand while the other side bluffed frantically in the dark. I returned to Chandler and resumed my position at my desk. The afternoon stretched on, filled with the soothing, predictable rhythm of my work. I focused on compiling back-end server logs, searching for a specific anomaly in a data packet transfer across a simulated municipal grid. I held a glass of iced water, taking slow, deliberate sips. The cold condensation dampened my fingertips. It was a moment of profound, ordinary peace, anchored by the certainty of mathematics and logic. Sitting mere inches from my keyboard, my smartphone began a relentless visual assault. I had silenced the ringer and disabled the vibration motor, but the screen continued to wake. It illuminated with incoming calls. My mother's name appeared, lingered for 30 seconds, faded to black, and immediately appeared again. The little red notification badge on the phone application climbed steadily. 10 missed calls, 20 missed calls, 30 missed calls. I watched the screen light up while my fingers continued to type lines of clean syntax. The contrast between my regulated environment and their escalating panic was stark. By the time I finished compiling the server logs and resolving the data routing error, the counter sat at 40 consecutive missed calls. Brenda was calling in a frantic, unbroken loop. The silence was driving them insane. They had expected me to crumble upon receiving the formal legal threat. They had anticipated a tearful surrender, a desperate plea for a settlement, or, at the very least, an angry confrontation they could use to gauge my fear. My refusal to engage denied them the friction they needed to sustain their momentum. Extortionists rely on a feedback loop. They apply pressure, and they monitor the reaction to determine their next move. By offering zero reaction, I starved their machinery. A starved predator, however, does not simply walk away. When a private tactic fails to produce a result, the desperation deepens, leading to reckless, irreversible decisions. My parents and Vanessa realized that intimidation and formal legal notices were vanishing into a void. To force a reaction, they needed an audience. They needed to apply a pressure so suffocating that I would be compelled to break my silence just to breathe. They were preparing to drag their fabricated narrative out of the shadows. Since they could not break me in private, they were going to attempt to destroy me in the public square, setting the stage for a catastrophic miscalculation. The 40 missed calls from my mother eventually ceased, leaving a deceptive tranquility in their wake. The digital silence did not signify a surrender. It indicated a tactical shift. When a closed loop of private intimidation fails to yield a financial result, desperate individuals invariably seek a larger arena. My family recognized that their isolated efforts were striking a reinforced wall. To breach that defense, they needed an army. They found one on the internet. Vanessa possessed a specific type of currency that I lacked. She commanded an audience. For years, she had cultivated a following of 30,000 users across her social platforms, projecting the image of a thriving Scottsdale boutique owner. Her followers bought into the curated aesthetic of sage-scented serenity and imported linens. They trusted her. They viewed her as a friend, a mentor in lifestyle entrepreneurship. They were entirely unaware that the Serene Boutique was a financial sinkhole operating on rotating credit lines and parental bailouts. My sister decided to weaponize that parasocial trust. Enraged by the sluggish pace of the legal system and frustrated by my steadfast refusal to engage with the discount attorney, she opted for the nuclear option. She launched a coordinated digital smear campaign designed to obliterate my reputation and force a swift settlement through public shame. The notification arrived on a Tuesday evening. A colleague from the co-working space forwarded a link to a video attaching a brief, concerned text asking if I was okay. I clicked the URL and watched my private family dysfunction broadcast to the world in high definition. Vanessa had staged the recording meticulously. She sat on a plush velvet chair inside Desert Aura, surrounded by the expensive inventory she could no longer afford. The harsh overhead retail lights were dimmed, replaced by the soft, sympathetic glow of a ring light. Her makeup was deliberately imperfect, featuring a faint smudge of mascara beneath her lower lashes to simulate recent tears. She stared directly into the lens, projecting a masterclass in manufactured vulnerability. She did not use my full name, but she provided enough identifying details to ensure anyone in the local Silicon Desert community could connect the dots. She spoke in a trembling voice about the devastating heartbreak of familial betrayal. She spun a tragic narrative explaining how her younger sister had recently stumbled into a multi-million-dollar local lottery jackpot. She detailed the sacrifices our parents had made, the struggles her small business endured, and the cold, callous way I had supposedly turned my back on the people who supported me. "You think you know someone?" Vanessa said to her camera, wiping a carefully placed tear from her cheek. "You think that if a miracle happens, a family will share that blessing. Instead, she locked her doors. She watched our parents face losing their home. She watched my business face eviction. She bought a new car and left us to drown. I never wanted to make this public, but when someone you love turns their back on you for money, you have to speak your truth." The video was a viral catalyst. It triggered the exact psychological response Vanessa had calculated. The internet thrives on righteous indignation, and she had offered them a perfect villain. I was painted as the greedy, newly minted millionaire, hoarding a windfall, while my hardworking, relatable sister wept on camera. The conflict spilled from the confines of a Tempe diner and a Mesa lawyer's office directly into the public square. The shares multiplied. The comment section became a toxic echo chamber of outrage. People I had never met drafted paragraphs detailing the specific karmic punishments I deserved. The Silicon Desert tech community is a dense, interconnected network. Startup founders, marketing directors, and independent developers share the same digital spaces. Vanessa's network intersected with mine, allowing the poison to seep into my professional periphery. This was the heavy, crushing boulder of a trial by public opinion. It is a modern, societal pressure cooker, engineered to inflict maximum psychological distress. The goal of a smear campaign is not to seek justice. The goal is to make the target's daily existence so excruciating, so fraught with anxiety and public judgment, that they willingly pay a ransom just to make the noise stop. Vanessa wanted to shame me into a wire transfer. I sat on my living room sofa, watching the view count climb. The urge to defend myself was a primal burning sensation in my chest. I wanted to post the corporate acquisition documents. I wanted to upload the security footage of Vanessa and Jared prying open my mailbox with a flathead screwdriver. I wanted to expose the fraudulent lawsuit and the misspelled letterhead. I reached for my keyboard and then I stopped. I remembered the pristine conference room on the 34th floor. I remembered David Caldwell intertwining his fingers and advising me to embrace the freeze. I was protected by the ironclad non-disclosure agreement. Vanessa's public screaming about a lottery ticket was actually reinforcing my cover story, shielding the true nature of the tech buyout from the public eye. Responding to her video would validate her premise. It would feed the algorithm and give her the engagement she desperately craved. I closed the browser window. I chose to hold the line, trusting the strategy over my ego. But ignoring the noise did not render me immune to the pain. Later that night, in a moment of weakness, I opened the application to check the comments on a secondary platform where the video had been cross-posted. Amidst the sea of anonymous vitriol, my eyes snagged on a familiar profile picture. It belonged to Mr. Davis, my old high school advanced placement calculus teacher. Mr. Davis was a quiet, principled man who had spent extra hours after school helping me grasp complex integrals. He was the first person to recognize my aptitude for logic and systematic problem solving. He had written the letter of recommendation that helped secure my college scholarship. He knew me as a dedicated, diligent student who always showed her work. Beneath Vanessa's tearful video, Mr. Davis had left a brief, simple comment. "Such a shame. Money changes people." That single sentence was a sharp, devastating pebble. It struck deeper than any of the anonymous threats or Vanessa's theatrical sobbing. Mr. Davis represented logic, fairness, and empirical truth. Seeing him manipulated by my sister's fiction, watching him offer his misguided pity and pass judgment on my character, caused a sudden, intense flash of pain. My chest tightened. I felt the sting of betrayal from a man whose respect I deeply valued. He had evaluated a false equation. Vanessa provided him with incorrect variables, and he had arrived at the logical, albeit incorrect, conclusion. He believed the lie because it was presented with the persuasive authority of grief. I hovered my thumb over the reply button. I could send him a private message. I could tell him to remember the girl who sat in his front row and double-checked her proofs. I could ask him to trust the math. I withdrew my hand. I refused to break my silence. I knew the actual mathematics of the situation. I knew the ledger of my family dynamic, the sum of their debts, and the precise value of the software I had coded. The math was entirely on my side, and math does not require an emotional defense. It simply requires patience until the final calculation is revealed. The smear campaign raged for weeks, generating a sustained cloud of toxicity that hung over my daily life. Yet, as the digital fire burned, a physical deadline approached on the calendar. The civil lawsuit filed by the discount attorney mandated an initial mediation session before proceeding to a formal trial docket. The court date was set. The noise of the internet was about to be confined to a single quiet room governed by the rules of evidence and perjury. The pressure continued to build, wrapping tight around my chest, setting the stage for an ultimate, undeniable confrontation. The mediation center occupied the 42nd floor of a glass tower in downtown Phoenix. The room was a study in sterile authority, walled in polished mahogany and thick soundproofed glass that overlooked the sprawling, sun-baked grid of the valley. A long oval table dominated the space, surrounded by heavy leather chairs designed to make the occupants feel either very powerful or very small. I sat next to David Caldwell, my posture rigid, my hands folded neatly on the smooth wooden surface. Across the table sat the opposition. Thomas, Brenda, and Vanessa had arrived 10 minutes early, accompanied by Gary Trenton. The discount attorney wore an ill-fitting navy suit that gathered in awkward folds around his shoulders. He carried a bulky leather briefcase that looked like a prop from a local theater production. My parents sat flanking him, projecting an aura of smug, victorious certainty. Vanessa sat at the far edge, clutching her phone, offering me a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. They believed the smear campaign had done its job. They assumed I was sitting in this room because the public pressure had fractured my resolve, and this mediation was merely the venue for my formal surrender. A retired state judge acting as the neutral mediator sat at the head of the table. He clicked a silver pen, adjusted his reading glasses, and activated a small digital recording device. He explained the parameters of the session. He outlined the rules of evidence, the purpose of the gathering, and the binding legal nature of the statements provided. He made it explicitly clear that any factual claims entered into the record were subject to the laws of perjury. Caldwell did not react to the warning. He simply nodded his face, a mask of polite indifference. I kept my gaze fixed on the center of the table. I was not here to argue. I was here to witness the construction of a grave. The mediator offered the floor to the plaintiffs. Gary Trenton cleared his throat, a wet, grating sound in the quiet room. He stood up, resting his knuckles on the mahogany, and launched into his opening remarks. He spoke of family betrayal, of broken promises, and of a daughter blinded by sudden wealth. It was a cheap theatrical performance designed for a jury that did not exist. Caldwell let him ramble, offering zero objections, allowing the opposing counsel to burn through his own credibility. Then Trenton gestured to my father. He asked Thomas to state his account of the events for the official record. Thomas sat forward. He adjusted his collar, took a slow breath, and began to weave a detailed, meticulous fiction. He understood that a lie requires structural supports to sound convincing, so he built his narrative using concrete, recognizable landmarks. He named a specific convenience store located on Ray Road in Chandler, a place I used to pass during my commute from the university. He claimed we met in the parking lot of that exact store on a Tuesday afternoon. He spoke with a steady practice cadence, describing the harsh glare of the afternoon sun and the sound of traffic rolling past the gas pumps. He stated that he pulled a crisp $10 bill from his wallet and handed it directly to me. He testified that he instructed me to purchase 2 random number lottery tickets using the exact phrase, "Let us split our luck today." He claimed I accepted the cash, agreed to the partnership, and walked into the store to finalize the transaction. The story was breathtaking in its specificity. My mother nodded along in solemn agreement, providing silent corroboration for a meeting that never happened. Vanessa watched the mediator eyes wide, performing the role of the wounded, loyal sibling. They were acting as a synchronized unit, united by a singular, consuming greed. But a lie, no matter how carefully rehearsed, exacts a physical toll on the body. I watched my father closely, bypassing his words to read his physiological responses. He wore a gray suit purchased off the rack, a garment that trapped the heat and betrayed his internal panic. Dark, damp patches were already forming beneath the arms of his jacket. A fine sheen of sweat coated his forehead, catching the recessed lighting of the boardroom. When the mediator asked him to state the exact date of the supposed verbal contract, the smooth facade cracked. Thomas hesitated for a fraction of a second. He recited the memorized date, but his voice wavered, a thin, fragile tremor slipping into the syllables. His throat worked as he swallowed hard, trying to push past the sudden suffocating reality of what he was doing. He was a man accustomed to bullying contractors and manipulating his family in the privacy of a living room. He was unused to delivering a fabricated narrative onto a federal legal record, while a digital recorder captured every stuttered breath. I sat perfectly still, my face an unreadable mask of corporate composure. I did not blink. I did not offer a scoff or a shake of my head. I observed his physical discomfort with the clinical detachment of an auditor reviewing a fraudulent ledger. The waver in his voice was the pebble that revealed the hollow center of his confidence. He knew he was lying, and he knew the consequences of the lie, but his desire for the money overrode his instinct for self-preservation. This was the true climax of the conflict. The danger was no longer emotional blackmail or a viral internet video. The danger was the willful, arrogant embrace of perjury. They were locking themselves into a severe legal fiction, constructing a trap with their own hands, because they were so certain of their narrative. They believed my silence was proof of my vulnerability. They assumed I had no defense because I had not offered one on the internet. They were committing a crime on the record, fueled by the delusion that they held all the cards. My mother leaned forward and added her own fabricated detail, claiming she was on speakerphone during the transaction and heard me agree to split the jackpot. She offered her own perjury to support his sealing her own fate right beside her husband. Vanessa chimed in, stating I had confessed the partnership to her days before my phone went silent. They were binding themselves together in a conspiracy of fraud. Caldwell took notes on his legal pad with a smooth, unhurried hand. He did not interrupt their testimony. He allowed the silence of the room to encourage them, providing them with enough rope to hang their entire case. Gary Trenton smiled, looking at the mediator with the triumphant expression of a man who believes he has just delivered a killing blow. He believed the detailed testimony, backed by 3 separate witnesses, had established an insurmountable burden of proof against a silent, uncooperative defendant. He smoothed the lapels of his ill-fitting suit and stood tall. Trenton cleared his throat one final time. He summarized the fictional partnership, highlighted the emotional damage inflicted upon his clients, and pointed a finger across the mahogany table. "My clients are not seeking punitive damages," Trenton said, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "They simply want what is legally and morally theirs. We demand the immediate transfer of $2.1 million to settle this matter today, or we proceed to trial." The echo of Gary Trenton's demand hung in the sterile, conditioned air of the mediation room. $2.1 million. The discount attorney remained standing for a moment longer, soaking in the perceived glory of his ultimatum, before lowering himself back into his heavy leather chair. Across the mahogany table, my father exhaled a long, shaky breath, a sound that carried the distinct texture of profound relief. My mother reached out and placed her hand over his, squeezing his knuckles in a silent display of triumph. Vanessa sat back, crossing her arms, her gaze fixed on me with a victorious sneer. They had executed their plan. They had delivered their rehearsed lines sworn under oath and demanded their ransom. They were waiting for my attorney to propose a counteroffer, expecting us to panic and attempt to negotiate the figure down to a manageable fraction. They believed the pressure of the room had broken my defenses. David Caldwell did not reach for a calculator. He did not ask the mediator for a private recess to confer with his client. He sat in his chair looking at opposing counsel with an expression of mild, clinical curiosity. Caldwell placed his hands flat on the polished wood. The small digital recorder resting in front of the retired judge continued to capture the silence, documenting the steady rhythm of a trap preparing to snap shut. Caldwell turned his attention to the mediator. He requested formal confirmation that the sworn statements provided by Thomas Brenda and Vanessa were fully entered into the official record. The judge nodded, confirming that the testimonies were secured under the penalties of perjury. Caldwell then looked directly at Trent, on his voice smooth, devoid of any friction or haste. He asked opposing counsel if his clients wished to amend any specific details of their narrative, perhaps adjusting a date, a location, or a piece of dialogue before the defense presented its response. Trenton chuckled, a dry, confident sound that scraped against the quiet of the boardroom. He stated that the testimony stood exactly as delivered. My family had locked the deadbolt from the inside, sealing themselves inside their own fiction. Caldwell nodded slowly. He reached down and rested his hand on the brass latches of his briefcase. The dual metallic clicks echoed sharply across the room. He lifted the lid and withdrew a thick, meticulously organized stack of documents. He did not look at my parents. He spoke directly to the opposing attorney, treating my family as irrelevant variables in a solved equation. Caldwell stated in a clear, resonant tone that his client rejected the settlement demand in its entirety. He paused, allowing the rejection to settle over the table. Trenton opened his mouth, leaning forward to launch a loud rebuttal, but Caldwell raised a single finger, demanding the floor. Then Caldwell delivered the sentence that shattered the foundation of their universe. He announced that Lydia Clare had never purchased a lottery ticket in her life. He stated that I had never stepped foot inside the convenience store on Ray Road, and I had never accepted a $10 bill from my father. My father surged forward in his seat, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. He attempted to shout, pointing a trembling finger at me, accusing Caldwell of playing semantic legal games. Trenton raised a hand to silence his client, sensing a sudden, dangerous shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room. Caldwell ignored the outburst. He reached into the stack of papers and pulled out the familiar blue presentation folder. He explained that my silence over the past few weeks was not an admission of guilt, nor was it a strategy born of fear. It was a strict legal requirement. Caldwell detailed the parameters of a federal non-disclosure agreement tied to a corporate technology acquisition. He stated that the mandated 6-month confidentiality blackout period had expired exactly 48 hours ago. I was finally legally permitted to introduce the true origin of my net worth into the public record. Caldwell slid the contents of the blue folder across the vast expanse of the mahogany table. The heavy stock paper came to rest directly in front of Gary Trenton. Caldwell narrated the documents as Trenton's eyes began to scan the text. He pointed to the intellectual property transfer agreement, citing the specific back-end routing algorithm I had coded from scratch in my Chandler apartment. He referenced the acquiring tech conglomerate, a prominent entity currently expanding operations in the Silicon Desert. Finally, Caldwell drew their attention to the appended wire transfer receipts. The document showed a direct corporate deposit into my personal accounts. The total sum was $4.2 million. It was the precise amount of the local lottery jackpot, a statistical anomaly that had birthed a monstrous consuming delusion. The truth did not merely defeat their civil lawsuit, it exposed them to catastrophic legal peril. There was no ticket. There was no shared luck. There was no verbal contract in a driveway. The money they were trying to extort was the product of my own solitary, grueling labor. They had just spent 20 minutes delivering highly detailed, coordinated perjury to a neutral mediator attempting to use the justice system to facilitate a multi-million-dollar fraud. They had sworn under oath to a series of events that physical, unassailable corporate records proved were impossible. I shifted my focus to Gary Trenton. The discount attorney was staring at the corporate acquisition documents. The smug, victorious posture he had maintained for the past hour melted away, replaced by the pale, rigid stiffness of a man realizing he has walked onto a live landmine. He read the signature lines. He verified the dates on the wire transfers. He looked at the sworn affidavits he had drafted for my family, comparing the dates of their fictional convenience store meeting against the timestamp of the tech buyout. The timelines did not just conflict, they obliterated each other. Trenton was a man who engineered quick settlements out of minor disputes. He was not equipped to handle federal fraud. He realized in real time that he had just facilitated outright extortion. He had presented perjured testimony to a former state judge. His license to practice law, his livelihood, and his freedom were suddenly in severe, immediate jeopardy because he had trusted the word of 3 desperate grifters. He held a heavy gold-plated fountain pen in his right hand. His fingers went slack. The pen slipped from his grasp. It hit the polished mahogany table with a sharp, heavy clatter, rolling a few inches before coming to a stop near the edge of the blue folder. He did not reach to retrieve it. He simply sat there, staring at the blue ink on the corporate contracts, his breathing shallow and rapid. The sound of the pen hitting the wood seemed to break the spell holding my family. My father looked at the documents, then looked at his lawyer, waiting for Trenton to shout an objection or dismiss the papers as a forgery. Trenton said nothing. My mother's breath hitched in her throat, a ragged, uneven sound. Vanessa stared at the wire transfer receipts, her eyes darting across the staggering number printed at the bottom of the page. The realization of what I had achieved crashed over them. I had built a fortune using my own intelligence, discipline, and skill. I had outperformed every expectation they ever had for the quiet, invisible workhorse. But right behind that realization came a second, darker wave. The magnitude of the crime they had just committed, trying to steal my work, settled over their shoulders. They had lied to a judge to steal money I earned. The silence that filled the mediation room was no longer the quiet of a tactical waiting game. It was a dense, suffocating vacuum. The air felt heavy, pressing down on my parents and my sister as the walls of their delusion collapsed around them. They could not argue, they could not scream, they could not deploy guilt or weaponized affection. The cold, empirical weight of the truth had pinned them to their chairs. I sat perfectly still, breathing in the sterile conditioned air of the high-rise, watching the exact moment my family realized they had dug a grave they would never climb out of. Gary Trenton did not speak for a long time. The dropped fountain pen rested on the mahogany grain, an instrument of extortion abandoned by a man who suddenly realized he was holding a live wire. He looked from the corporate wire transfer receipts to my father. Thomas tried to meet his gaze, projecting a false, crumbling defiance, but the discount attorney was already calculating the survival metrics of his own career. He had presented sworn testimony to a retired judge in a formal setting. If this proceeded any further, Caldwell would hand the transcripts and the corporate buyout proof directly to the State Bar Association and the district attorney. Trenton reached out with a trembling hand and collected his pen. He did not place it back in his breast pocket. He dropped it haphazardly into his bulky leather briefcase. He began gathering his legal pads, sweeping the fabricated affidavits into a chaotic pile, shoving them inside the satchel. He avoided making eye contact with Caldwell. Caldwell represented the apex of the legal hierarchy Trenton had just attempted to game, and the discrepancy in their power was now agonizingly clear. Trenton looked at the mediator. He stated for the record that he was withdrawing his representation of the plaintiffs, effective immediately. He cited an irreconcilable conflict of interest and the discovery of fraudulent information withheld by his clients. My father stood up. The legs of his heavy leather chair scraped harshly against the carpet. He reached out, grabbing the sleeve of Trenton's navy jacket. He ordered the lawyer to sit down, insisting they could figure this out, insisting the technology money was still subject to family obligations. Trenton yanked his arm away with a visceral shudder of disgust. He told Thomas not to touch him. He told Thomas not to call his office ever again. He snapped the brass buckles of his briefcase shut, turned on his heel, and walked out of the room. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind him. The sound echoed in the sterile space, sealing my family inside the ruins of their own construction. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The offensive line had collapsed. The predators were suddenly the prey, isolated in a high-rise tower without legal counsel, facing a corporate litigator and a daughter who had just outmaneuvered their entire grift. My father sank back into his chair. The dark patches of sweat on his suit jacket seemed to expand. He stared at the blue folder, the reality of my $4 million net worth, finally bypassing his ego and settling into his consciousness. He realized the capital was real, but his access to it was dead. The fortune he had plotted to control was sitting across the table, legally protected and entirely out of his reach. Vanessa pressed her hands against her face. The designer handbag sitting near her feet offered no protection against the impending collapse of her Scottsdale boutique. The smoldering contempt she had directed at me evaporated. A hollow, breathless panic took its place. She was looking at a future where the bailouts had permanently ceased. My mother, however, possessed a terrifying capacity for adaptation. Brenda had spent her entire life smoothing over the sharp edges of my father's failures and my sister's debts. She operated on the belief that any conflict could be suffocated by a blanket of manufactured warmth. She observed the ashes of their extortion attempt and decided to simply change the narrative. She believed she could rewrite history while sitting in the exact room where she had just committed perjury. Brenda leaned forward, resting her arms on the polished table. She forced her facial muscles to relax, conjuring a fragile, trembling smile. She looked at me, attempting to bypass the presence of the mediator and my attorney. She was trying to speak directly to the invisible workhorse she had trained for 23 years. She said the software buyout was wonderful news. She said they had misunderstood the situation, that the local news broadcast had confused them, and that they had only pursued the lawsuit out of a desperate need to keep the family afloat. She lowered her voice, injecting a soft, pleading rhythm into the syllables. She suggested that we could drop all the legal hostilities right now. She proposed that since the wealth was real, we could still function as a unified group. We could share the technology money, save Vanessa's store, and move forward together. Then Brenda used a specific word of endearment. She called me sweetheart. The word hung in the conditioned air of the boardroom. It was a term she had used outside the diner, a velvet glove wrapped around a demand for cash. Now it was a desperate tether thrown across a widening abyss. She was asking me to ignore a coordinated attempt to steal my assets and accept a toxic embrace simply because we shared a bloodline. I did not offer a polite smile. I did not shake my head. I sat in my chair and delivered a dead, unblinking silence. I looked directly into her eyes, keeping my facial expression entirely blank, letting the quiet stretch until the air in the room felt too thick to breathe. I watched her trembling smile falter. I watched the realization dawn in her eyes that the emotional currency she had relied on for 2 decades held zero purchasing power. The silence was the pebble that shattered her pivot. It confirmed without a single spoken syllable that our relationship was permanently deceased. Caldwell recognized the shift in the room. He knew the emotional defense was neutralized. He reached into his briefcase one final time, retrieving a slim manila folder. He opened it and produced a single high-resolution color photograph alongside a sleek digital thumb drive. He slid the items across the mahogany table until they came to rest in front of my parents. The photograph was a still frame captured from my security camera. It depicted Vanessa and Jared standing on the concrete landing of my apartment complex. Jared was holding a steel screwdriver, actively prying the locked door of my aluminum mailbox open, while Vanessa reached inside. Vanessa gasped a sharp, ragged sound that bounced off the glass walls. She covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with terror. I broke my silence. My voice was calm, analytical, and devoid of sympathy. I explained that the digital drive contained the full video of the event, complete with audio recordings of their conversation. I reminded them that the destruction of a residential mailbox and the theft of postal correspondence are federal offenses investigated by federal inspectors and prosecuted in federal courts. My parents stared at the photograph. The gravity of the situation pressed down on them. They had walked into this building expecting to leave with a multi-million-dollar settlement. Instead, they were looking at a piece of physical evidence that could send their golden child and her husband to a federal penitentiary. The fabricated lawsuit was a disaster, but the mail theft was an undeniable, documented crime. I delivered my terms. I stated that I would not forward the security footage to the authorities on one very specific condition. They were going to sign a permanent, binding, no-contact order. The legal document would prohibit Thomas, Brenda, Vanessa, and Jared from ever calling my phone, emailing my accounts, or approaching my residence and workplace. Furthermore, they were going to assume the financial burden of their failed extortion. I demanded they cover the entire cost of David Caldwell's legal retainer, reimbursing me for the expenses I incurred defending myself against their fraudulent lawsuit. If they refused, or if they ever attempted to contact me again in any capacity, the thumb drive would be delivered to the postal inspector by the end of the business day. The perjury transcripts from this mediation session would accompany the video. They were trading their silence and their remaining capital for Vanessa's freedom. Thomas looked at the photograph, then looked at the blue folder containing the reality of my independence. He opened his mouth to negotiate to find some sliver of pride or leverage, but the facts offered no room for maneuver. He closed his mouth and nodded a slow, defeated motion. The mediation session was over. The extortion ring was broken. I stood up from my heavy leather chair. I smoothed the fabric of my trousers, picked up my briefcase, and turned toward the exit. I did not say goodbye. I walked out of the mahogany boardroom, stepped into the quiet carpeted hallway of the high-rise, and walked toward the elevators. I left my family sitting in the exact center of the financial and legal ruin they had manufactured entirely by themselves. Stepping out of the chilled lobby of the downtown high-rise and into the bright Arizona sun, I felt an immediate shift in the atmospheric pressure of my life. The desert heat radiated off the concrete sidewalks, warming my skin, but the heavy weight that had rested on my chest for 23 years was gone. I walked toward my hybrid vehicle, unlocked the doors, and slid into the driver's seat. I did not cry. I did not tremble with adrenaline. I started the engine and merged onto the busy freeway, leaving the towering glass structures of the city skyline in my rearview mirror. I drove back to my apartment in Chandler, fully aware that I would not be staying in that zip code much longer. The desert had always been my geographic home, but it was also the center of an ecosystem that required my constant, silent sacrifice. To protect the asset I had built, I needed to alter my environment entirely. I initiated the relocation process the very next morning. Over the following 3 weeks, my daily routine became an exercise in deliberate curation. I secured a lease on a modern loft in Austin, Texas. I selected a vibrant technology hub where the industry moved at a rapid pace and the professional horizon felt wide open. I packed my minimalist Chandler apartment with methodical precision. I folded my faded sweaters into square cardboard boxes, wrapped my dual monitors in layers of protective bubble wrap, and secured the seams with thick packing tape. Every box I taped shut felt like providing physical closure to a specific chapter of my youth. I was not running away from my history. I was simply closing an account that no longer yielded a positive return. I retained David Caldwell to finalize the remaining legal logistics, trusting him to manage the paperwork with the same clinical efficiency he had displayed in the mahogany boardroom. The final settlement documents arrived at my office via secure courier a few days prior to my departure. I sat at my desk and reviewed the crisp pages. Thomas, Brenda, Vanessa, and Jared had signed the permanent no-contact orders. Their signatures appeared jagged and erratic, betraying the nervous tension of individuals forced to surrender their last shred of leverage. The financial obligations had also been satisfied. My father wired the exact sum required to cover the staggering legal retainer, draining a substantial portion of his remaining liquid assets. I learned through a mutual acquaintance that Thomas was forced to sell his primary vehicle and liquidate a small retirement account just to satisfy the debt and pay his own discount attorney. There was no fairy tale redemption for my relatives. The universe rarely offers sudden clarity to people who refuse to examine their own flaws. They were left exactly where their choices led them. Without the constant influx of parental bailouts and my silent financial buffer, Vanessa and her Scottsdale boutique rapidly collapsed. The commercial landlord proceeded with the eviction process. The imported woven baskets, the expensive organic linens, and the sage candles were liquidated for pennies on the dollar to satisfy impatient wholesale vendors. Desert Aura shuttered its doors permanently, a victim of extreme debt and terrible business acumen. Vanessa and Jared were forced to face their creditors without a safety net, navigating a harsh reality where curated internet aesthetics offered zero protection against bankruptcy proceedings. My parents were left managing a shrinking household budget, unable to afford the luxury motor coach they had tried to extort from me. They had broken their family apart in pursuit of a phantom jackpot, and they were left holding the ashes of a fire they started themselves. I observed their downfall from a distance, feeling a profound, steady calm. The trauma of their betrayal had been metabolized into a durable, protective armor. I no longer felt the compulsive, draining urge to fix their mistakes. I did not feel responsible for their sadness or their empty bank accounts. I had achieved total emotional, legal, and financial independence. The invisible workhorse was dead, replaced by a woman who understood her own value and refused to discount it for anyone. When you stop paying the ransom for conditional love, you discover that the hostage was actually the person holding the weapon. They were trapped in their cycle of resentment, while I was unburdened, looking toward a future dictated entirely by my own rational choices. On my final day in Arizona, I stood in Terminal 4 of Sky Harbor International Airport. My checked luggage was already routed to Austin. I carried only a sleek leather backpack containing my laptop and a few essential documents. I found a quiet seat in the departure lounge, shielded from the bustling crowds by a frosted glass partition. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I watched the sun dip below the jagged silhouette of the distant mountains. The sky transitioned from a brilliant blue into deep shades of violet and burnt orange. It was a beautiful, familiar sunset, serving as a fitting backdrop for a clean departure. I unzipped my backpack and retrieved my laptop. I placed the silver device on my lap and opened the screen. The operating system booted up instantly, greeting me with a blank desktop. I bypassed the news feeds and the email clients, opening a raw code editor instead. I loaded a personal side project, a new logistical framework I was testing, strictly for the intellectual challenge. I stared at the dark screen, scanning a perfectly clean, elegant block of syntax. The variables were clearly defined. The logic flowed in a rational, unbroken sequence. The text glowed in soft shades of green and blue against the black background. If an error occurred within this script, the system generated a clear diagnostic report, allowing me to identify the flaw and correct it without dealing with guilt or manipulation. I found profound peace in a system that behaved rationally. For 23 years, I had navigated a household plagued by emotional bugs, broken logic, and corrupted data. I had spent my youth trying to debug a family dynamic that actively resisted repair. Now, looking at the glowing characters on my screen, I felt the sheer relief of stepping into a logical universe. I was fully free from their programming. I compiled the script, watched the successful execution protocol light up the terminal window, and closed the laptop. The boarding announcement for my flight echoed softly over the public address system. I gathered my belongings and walked toward the gate. A new city was waiting, offering a blank slate and a thriving industry where competence was the only currency that mattered. I had paid my dues, learned the exchange rate of false affection, and secured my assets. If you have ever been the quiet one in your family, the person tasked with absorbing the shockwaves of other people making bad decisions, hear this truth. You are not obligated to finance a dynamic that drains your spirit. You do not need their permission to stop writing the checks. True honor is not keeping the peace for people who exploit you. True honor is looking at the ledger, realizing the cost is too high, and walking away with the receipts. You have the right to cancel the contract. You have the right to close the folder. If this story gave you the clarity to examine your own boundaries, drop a comment below and share your turning point. Subscribe to Cute Told Stories for more stories about setting limits and finding peace. Take care of your own foundation, because you are the only one who has to live inside it. We sit in our living rooms, surrounded by the curated artifacts of the American dream, and we tell ourselves that we are building a sanctuary. We believe that by providing a roof, a warm meal, and a foundation of traditional values, we are insulating our children from the harshness of the world. But what happens when the harshness does not come from the outside? What happens when the spiritual sickness takes root right at the kitchen table? The story of the phantom lottery ticket, the tale of a daughter targeted by her own blood for a fortune she built, not won, is more than a drama. It is a mirror held up to the modern family, revealing the fragile line between unconditional love and transactional greed. In our culture, there is a dangerous romance attached to the idea of the quick fix. We are surrounded by narratives of sudden wealth, overnight success, and the lucky break that changes everything in a heartbeat. When the parents in our story saw a news broadcast about a local jackpot, they were blinded by this exact illusion. They abandoned reality, choosing to place their faith in a random cosmic accident, rather than acknowledging the grueling quiet hours their daughter spent writing code. As a spiritual practitioner, looking at the state of our society, this is the first great failure of guidance. We must teach our children to see through the mirage of luck. Just as ancient astrological cycles remind us that true, enduring prosperity is forged through the steadfast, grounded endurance of the ox, we must model that same resilience in our homes. Enduring success is not a scratch-off ticket. It is the discipline of showing up day after day to master your craft. When we raise our children to chase windfalls, we rob them of the profound satisfaction of earning their own ground. We must guide them to understand that the universe honors logic, effort, and self-mastery, not the desperate hope of a shortcut. But perhaps the deepest tragedy of this family's collapse lies in the corruption of love itself. A traditional home is meant to be a sanctuary, a place where a child's worth is intrinsic and absolute. In this narrative, the parents turn their familial bond into a cold balance sheet. They weaponize the sacred concept of family to extract resources, treating their oldest daughter as a fragile investment to be continually bailed out, and their youngest as a utility, a shock absorber for their own anxieties. They loved the fantasy the golden child projected, and they valued the workhorse only for the debts she could silently clear. This transactional dynamic severs the sacred energetic cord that connects parent to child. Morality in parenting dictates that we untangle love from utility. We must love our children unconditionally for who they are, not conditionally for what they can provide or the status they can reflect back upon us. When we view a child as a safety net to absorb our own financial or emotional failures, we burden them with a debt they never signed for. Healing our own anxieties is our profound responsibility. It ensures we do not pass the bill to our children, forcing them to purchase their seat at the dinner table. How do we prepare our children to navigate a world that will inevitably test them? We often confuse willpower with volume. We teach our kids to stand up to, fight back, to argue their point until they are heard. Yet the protagonist's ultimate victory in this modern parable was not secured through shouting vengeance or a public spectacle. It was secured through a profound, unshakable stillness. When faced with escalating emotional blackmail, a viral smear campaign, and even a fabricated lawsuit, she did not match her family's chaotic energy. She embodied the spiritual principle of non-action. She allowed their aggressive momentum to become their own undoing. True willpower is the emotional discipline to sit quietly amidst a storm. As parents, we must model this emotional regulation. We must show our children that they do not have to attend every argument to which they are invited. Setting a boundary is not an act of warfare. It is the highest form of self-respect. When you know your own truth, you do not need to scream it. You simply stand your ground and let the silence do the heavy lifting. Finally, this narrative stands as a stark testament to the inescapable law of cause and effect. The parents and the golden child attempted to manipulate reality, weaving a tangled web of deceit, emotional extortion, and eventually perjury. They believed they could outsmart the consequences of their actions if they simply wanted the money badly enough. But the universe always balances its books. Their attempts to steal what was not theirs led directly to their own financial and social ruin, leaving them isolated in the ashes of their own greed. We must raise children who understand that integrity is not merely a moral suggestion or a nice idea for a Sunday school lesson. Integrity is protective armor. When you operate in truth, you do not need to memorize your lies, and you never have to fear the light of discovery. A life built on authenticity is the only structure that can withstand the test of time. It is a heavy thing to examine the foundations of our own homes. We look at the sacrifices we make, the rules we enforce, and the love we offer, hoping we are building a legacy of wisdom and strength. But narratives like this ask us to look closer, to audit the emotional currency we exchange with the people we hold dearest. Are we teaching our children to be strong, or are we teaching them to be useful? Are we offering a sanctuary or a marketplace? If exploring these shadowed corners of family dynamics, discovering where toxic patterns meet quiet strength resonates with your journey, then you belong here with us. Drop a comment sharing the boundaries you have had to draw in your own life, and be sure to subscribe to QT Told Stories for more stories that uncover the profound truths hidden behind closed doors. The line between love and obligation is often so thin it becomes invisible until it snaps. You might look across the table tonight at the people who share your name. The plates are warm, the conversation is familiar, and the walls are sturdy. But as the evening settles into quiet, you have to ask yourself, if the resources disappeared tomorrow, would the chairs remain full, or were you only ever renting their presence?